And our next speaker, Rob Nurre, is going to help transition us into something that's really been on my mind a lot, and that is, how are we thinking about caring for both the natural landscapes that we own and manage and the cultural landscapes that are embedded in these natural landscapes. Rob received his undergrad degree from University of Wisconsin Stevens Point in environmental education. I'm also a graduate, not of Stevens Point, but of a major in environmental education. So Rob and I just learned we shared that interest. He told me just a little funny quip about his background. He said somebody who was interviewing him for a job said, "Rob, either you want to do everything possible before you die, or you've had a really hard time holding on to jobs." He has spent his life's work at the intersection of cultural and natural landscapes. He considers himself a cultural landscape historian, actually just more maybe a landscape historian across cultural and natural aspects. For 20 years, he served as the land records director for Wisconsin Bureau of Commissioners, Wisconsin Board of Commissioners of Public Lands. 20 years looking after land records. That must have been sometimes a tedious job, Rob. Currently, he serves as a consultant for organizations like JDCF, looking at how to care for and accentuate at the same time respecting the mounds, how to care for them, but also allow people to see these features on the landscape. So please join me in welcoming Rob Nurre.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate being part of today's program. I have to be honest with you that being at this point of the program has gotten to be a little scary. If nothing else, all of the things that I've been hearing, the sage thoughts we just got from Eli, the wonderful talk that we got from Kay Rhodes last night, has made me wonder whether I really should be here or just say, remember all the good things I just said, because that's what was important. But if you'll put up with me for a little bit, we are going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done and have had the pleasure of working with other people on caring for effigy mounds. It's interesting that the word caring has showed up a couple of times. You just mentioned it as you were talking about caring for those artifacts at the museum. And it was talked about as well in one of the interviews that we talked about just before lunch with people thinking about sites and being caretakers of that. Well, the title I think that's in the program for me is that I am the caretaker of the Man Mound National Historic Landmark. And that is a title that I wear very proudly. It's interesting because when I first started using that term about 10 years ago, I must admit the word caretaker didn't always strike me real well. I guess I had these visions of the guys who worked at summer camps and kind of lived in that weird little cabin back in the woods, and you kind of wondered about, well, and lots of things. So, you know, people have referred to me as a curator and as a keeper and as a manager and all those good things. But I've really come to embrace the term caretaker because I am fortunate enough to have the responsibility of caring for sites that were created by peoples who lived on this land thousands of years ago. And that is a responsibility I take very seriously. As you might guess, my ancestry is not Native American. My ancestry is Irish and German. And I feel, quite honestly, honored that the Native peoples who are the cultural owners of these sites seem to think that I do a fairly good job taking care of them. And again, I take great honor in that. What I'll be doing this afternoon is talking a little bit about how I have worked with some sites and some of the experiences I've had. This is where I throw in my favorite quote from Groucho Marx: learn from the mistakes of others because you can't live long enough to make them all yourself. This is an idea of learning from what we do. And there are mistakes that I've made, and I'll fess up to a few of them perhaps today, but it's a learning process. If you have come here today for the cookbook instructions for how to take care of effigy mound sites, I'm sorry. Albert just put his hand behind his ear because he wanted to know what golden words I had. Sorry, Albert. We're working on it. We're working on it together is the important thing. The Man Mound, and we'll get into some images of it in a bit, became 2 years, 3 days ago, the very first effigy mound that was designated by the National Park Service as a National Historic Landmark, which effectively is a National Register of Historic Places place on steroids. It is much harder to get on. It is one that there are many fewer sites. And again, we're the very first effigy mound that has that designation. That does not make us any more important than any other mound, but it's, quite honestly, we were willing to go through the 5-year process to do the paperwork to get on it. And a year ago this summer, we did an event at the Man Mound to note that designation. And I don't do this to show off, and I hope it'll come through appropriately, but at that day, the head of Heritage Preservation for the Ho-Chunk Nation, who is also the former president of that nation, John Greendeer, placed around my neck this medallion. It's a little hard to see. I'll put something white behind it so you can see a little easier. It's actually something that John carved, and it is the head of the Man Mound. And I asked John, what's the right time to wear this? And he said, anytime you're talking about the mounds. So I very proudly wear it when I have the occasion to speak about the work that we do. And if nothing else, it reminds me that I am speaking for and I am representing people of a culture that I am not native to. So that's what we're here all about. I wanted to say one more thing about carrying before we get into this, and that is at an event that was billed as a management, protection, maintenance conference on effigy mounds. And I managed to be the last speaker, and I said, we've been here all day. I hate the title. Because management, protection, maintenance all comes from up here. Caring comes from here, right about where this medallion hangs, from the heart. And that's how we need to think about these sites, is doing right by them and doing it from the heart. So again, that's where the title comes from. That's the Man Mound. It is, well, the best way to describe it is to read to you the first written description of the Man Mound. And this was written by a gentleman by the name of Increase Allen Lapham in 1859. And it was published in the 1859 edition of Wisconsin Historical Collections. Yes, this is the original, and this is what Lapham wrote. He said, I wish to announce the discovery by Mr. William H. Canfield near Baraboo in Sauk County of an artificial mound or earthwork of the most strange and extraordinary character of any yet brought to light. It represents, as will be seen in the accompanying drawing, very clearly and decidedly the human form in the act of walking and with an expression of boldness and decision that cannot be mistaken. The figure is no less than 214 feet in length, the head 30 feet long, the body 100, and the legs 84. The head lies towards the south, and the motion is westwards. All the lines of this most singular effigy are curved gracefully, much care having been bestowed upon its construction. The head is ornamented with 2 projections or horns. The arms and legs are too short for proper proportion, and the lower part of the body is too narrow, but with these exceptions, the general proportions are good. The drawing is made from notes of a very minute and careful survey and measurement by Mr. Canfield. The method of survey adopted was to run a straight line over the middle of the figure, lengthwise, and at intervals of every 10 feet to measure at right angles to the bordering lines of the figure. This remarkable man lies on the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter of Section 28 in Township 12 North, Range 7 East of the 4 miles east of Baraboo, and was surveyed on July 23, 1859. Lapham had not been there at the time, but Increase Lapham, and some of you may recognize the name, had 4 years earlier published the book entitled The Antiquities of Wisconsin. And this book is the very first book that was created that noted the effigy mounds in this region, primarily Wisconsin, a little bit here in Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. Canfield was one of his informants, had provided him information. And because of that, he gave Canfield a copy of this publication by the Smithsonian Institution, part of its Contributions to Knowledge series. The plates in the back of this mound, or excuse me, of this book, were printed on one side, in this case, several bear mounds that Lapham had noted. But the back sides were blank. And Canfield, in his copy, used those blank back sides to draw further mounds that he found, including the Man Mound. No, this is not his original book. It is one of the original publications from 1855. His original book is in the Sauk County Historical Society, but this is exactly where that drawing is. So there is this connection to what this land is all about, and a connection to these places and how we have perceived them. I want to go back to Lapham's comments a little bit. One of the phrases he used is, Canfield discovered. I almost edited that as I was printing it, but I wanted to use his original words because from a Western perspective, perhaps he did discover it, from a perspective of the non-native peoples. But this was a place that was known to the native peoples for generations. And we need to respect that fact that even though the majority of us here today are of European or other non-native cultures, these people were here and still are here, as we have heard so well expressed today. And we need to recognize that these sites are part of the culture of a people who have been on this land now for thousands of years. The Man Mound looks like this today. It has a distinction of being the very first effigy mound that was ever purchased specifically for preservation. In 1907, the owner of this land, he had gotten it from his father when his father passed away, and he thought, well, I could enlarge my cornfield by about an acre if I were to plow down this thing that my dad kept at the corner of his 80-acre farm. But he was wise enough or thoughtful enough to say, but if there's somebody else who'd like to pay me for it, I will gladly part with it. So at that point, the brand new Sauk County Historical Society and the brand new Wisconsin Archaeological Society and the Wisconsin Federation of Women's Clubs got together and raised $225 to buy the acre and a quarter that includes the Man Mound. That's equivalent to about $7,000 today, just for comparison's sake. And it is considered to be the very first of the effigy mounds in the Effigy Mound region that we'll look at in a moment, to have been purchased specifically for the preservation of that mound. Sadly, as you'll note, before that purchase was made in 1907, a road had been cut through the Man Mound. Interestingly, we tend, for some reason, to name roads for things that they destroy. So that road is Man Mound Road. And when it was preserved, all that was purchased was that area, and the head is to the south, the area south of the road. The road itself and the area where the feet were not included in the preservation. And how I got involved with this was about 10 years ago. Having visited this site, I got rather fascinated with it and realized that the 100th anniversary of its preservation was coming up and thought, this is a good time to highlight this site. It had quite honestly become an incredibly sleepy little county park, for that's how it's managed by the county today. And so we ended up having 500 people show up to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the preservation of this mound. And as part of that, I contacted the owners of the farm to the north, and you'll see that the feet of the Man Mound are actually in a calf pasture. And I just went over and said, any chance you would mind if I went over there and put some flags around where the feet are? Because we had Canfield's drawing, and so we knew exactly where those feet would have been located. And the gentleman I was talking to was a fourth generation farmer on that land. And he said, we've just been waiting for somebody to be interested enough. And he went out that afternoon and put up that little piece of fence that you see around where those mounds were. And ever since then, we have kept those feet marked. I also went to the town board, this is a town road, went to the town board and said, could I get permission to paint the legs on the road? And the chairman of the town board said, no, you absolutely cannot do that. His point was, yeah, that's a great idea, but I can't give you permission because if somebody thinks it's a stop line and liability, it's the bane of our existence. So we have kept the legs painted. When we began to go through the process, after this was done, this had been on the National Register of Historic Places since the 70s, and because of marking the feet, we decided to expand the boundaries of the National Register, and from that, the idea came to work on being a National Historic Landmark, and that's what we achieved a little over 2 years ago. The boundaries of that National Historic Landmark are 25 feet from the edge of the feet. And in fact, what we did this year, I unfortunately don't have a good photograph of it, is we expanded that area. And the other thing that has changed, if you were to look at this today, this photo is from 4 years ago. If you were to look at it today, the feet are no longer white. In this case, the farmer offered me some agricultural plastic to lay down on that, and it worked very well. It got people's attention, but the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ho-Chunk Nation, in a meeting we had one day, said, Rob, I really like the idea that you're marking those feet, but the plastic will not allow the rain to get to Mother Earth. So we have since planted that area with it's a special kind of grass called no-mow grass, which will grow up to about 18 inches tall and stop. And then we mow the regular park grass around that. So what you will see if you go up there today is much more subtle. It's not quite as in your face, but it is, I hope, much more appropriate in terms of how we manage this place. The other big changes we've made, if you notice in this photo that the man is black. Well, that's because it was burned 2 days before this. For about 50 years prior to my getting involved, the county parks had run a riding lawnmower once a week all summer long over that mound, which in some ways made it nice and visible, but also probably was not a particularly appropriate way for managing a mound. We put a stop to that. And interestingly, we just began to allow the grasses that were there to grow. And what's amazing is if you were there today, you'd find about half of what's there is native plants. I didn't plant any of them. They have all come in on their own. In fact, fascinatingly, on the head of the Man Mound has come in almost entirely as ferns. And someone referred to it the other day as a crown on this mound. And it's just spectacular to watch what happens. We burn it every year. In this case, right after I burned it, I took Canfield's drawing and went out and remeasured, and that's the fine white line that you may be able to see around the mound in the black. And that is to give me an idea of how close Canfield's work was. And it's really quite fascinating and very, very close. So that's the site I get to deal with. When people ask me where I live, I can give them my street address on Man Mound Road, but what I like to do is say that I live 17 Man Mound size steps east of the Man Mound. As you will find out by the time our time here is done, and I better get my watch out so I don't go too long, I've become rather obsessed with this place. It's as simple as that. I ended up buying a house just down the road when it became available so I could walk to the Man Mound rather than having to drive to it. So that's our Man Mound. Let's see what else I've got in here that's worth looking at. Oh, okay. In 1908, when this place was first dedicated, this marker was put in. It's actually very nice bronze marker. And this is one of the things we'll be getting into is how we, especially as European communities, mark these sites. It has the name Man Mound Park. It lists the organizations that were involved with preserving it. Sadly, Wisconsin Federation of Women's Clubs is just noted with initials, and that sadly gets lost as part of the history. It gives on the left-hand side some of the data, again, a very Western perspective. But what I do like about this image is that on the left-hand side, it does have the image of the Man Mound. Because effigy mounds are hard to see. They are very, very subtle on the landscape, and we'll look at a few pictures as we go along. But it very much helps visitors to the site to see that image so that that very subtle mound that stretches out in front of them, they can envision what it is. And even more so in this case, to have that in 3 dimensions, I think makes a great deal of difference as people try to get a sense of what that mound is. This is the plaque. When you become a National Historic Landmark, you do not get buckets of money. You do not get all sorts of help from the National Park Service. You get good wishes and all the rest of that. But you get a plaque. And so, though I'm somewhat skeptical about putting plaques on effigy mounds, we added this plaque. And this does tell the story. I certainly can't make it out looking at the little screen there, and I can't read it up there, but it basically says, this site is significant because it is one of the few, and it's actually the only one that we know of a rare style of effigy mound, a humanoid shape, and then goes on to describe what effigy mounds are in general. We can look at the effigy mound in other ways. This is LiDAR. It's one of the things that was discussed this morning. Not the best LiDAR image, but it's kind of neat to see that sort of ghost image of the man. This is what it looked like about the time it was dedicated as the Man Mound Park in 1908. Sort of a traditional thing that was done at the time of outlining it in lime. But you can see that the road is already cut off at that point. And this is where a couple of parts of my life come together. As Steve mentioned, I worked for the Wisconsin Board of Commissioners of Public Lands, and that agency holds the original public land survey records. And any of you who've done work in natural area restoration may have played a little bit in what are known as the General Land Office survey notes, the GLO notes, because the surveyors along the way noted what the vegetation was. That's a whole nother lecture. The reason that the Man Mound's legs are chopped off is because it is in the unfortunate position of being exactly 67.5 miles north of the Wisconsin-Illinois border. So it is it's in the 12th township north, each township being 6 miles. That gets us up to 66, and it is 1.5 miles, and roads were very often put down on section lines or quarter section lines. Interestingly, the gentleman who was the county surveyor and responsible for laying out roads at the time Man Mound Road was put in was the very same gentleman who had mapped it a few years earlier, William H. Canfield. So it's this kind of double-edged sword that there was a recognition that this place was really important, but the flip side of that was there was this idea that we had to put a road in. Interestingly, we'll be hearing from one of the past presidents of the Ho-Chunk Nation in a bit, and the person who's currently in that job, whenever I see him, his first question of me is, "Rob, have you moved the road yet?" And my response is, "Willie, I'm still working on it." Wilfred Cleveland is his name. Those survey records, however, of the Public Land Survey, in terms of effigy mounds, have proved to be somewhat valuable. This is a survey north of Milwaukee in 1835, and it is, I believe, the very first written record of an effigy mound. And this was a surveyor by the name of William Austin Burt, who was running a survey line, and he had been told by his supervisors, who were all out of southern Ohio, to, as part of his instructions, to record ancient works of art. And thus, when he went through this Effigy Mound area, he stopped and made these additional notes about this spot, which has since become known as the Lizard Mound State Park, now Lizard Mound County Park, and is preserved to this day. And one of the reasons we know about it is because of the work of the surveyors as they came through. So like a lot of things that we've been talking about all day, a lot of these things are double-edged swords, and we need to be aware of that as we go along. So this may be where I should have started, and that is, what are effigy mounds? Well, I have a lot of school kids come to the Man Mound, and I ask them what effigy mounds are, and they say, well, they're effigy mounds. So let's do the word effigy. Anybody care to give a definition of the word effigy? Pardon?
Likeness.
A likeness? The way I first heard the word was burning someone in effigy. The idea of making a model of someone, say a politician, and lighting it afire as a means of disrespect in this case. I won't name any politicians in particular, but that's just beside the point. But it is that idea. It is something that is in a likeness. And the effigy mounds that we find through southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, a little bit into Iowa, a little bit into Minnesota, are mounds of earth that have been carefully sculpted in the shapes of either actual or spiritual animals. That's the best definition I can come up with. And it's important to think actual and spiritual, because some of these mounds are certainly representing things that as a biologist I could not identify as being part of the native flora, or fauna, excuse me. So we need to think about what these things are representing. This gives a quick outline of some of these mounds. Obviously the man, a couple of birds, a bear, a deer, a turtle, and the panther is the other one. I believe earlier on today somebody was mentioning the panther, the water panther. And this is one of these things that is likely, and this is where I have to be real careful, again, because I am not a native person, is there is a very generic belief that there are three realms that both these actual animals as well as the spiritual beings exist in. Those in the sky, those on the land, and those in the water, which includes a watery underworld. And one of the inhabitants of that is been described as being water panthers, also described as being water spirits. So these things that are described as panthers are often thought to represent water spirits. Effigy mounds in size, and there are a few in this area, and hopefully, how many of you have ever been to the Effigy Mound up at Casper? Okay, good, glad to hear it. If you haven't, go. I was there yesterday, it's spectacular. These mounds are very subtle on the landscape. They vary in size from 30 feet, perhaps smaller, to the largest that I've ever become aware of is a bird mound that was fully a quarter mile from wingtip to wingtip. So they can be huge, and they were obviously an incredible amount of work to make. This is a map that gives an idea of where these mounds were. Where I live is, quite honestly, right in the middle of the Effigy Mounds area. And very often people who I deal with who are not particularly aware of these just assume effigy mounds are everywhere. Well, they're not. The effigy mounds, at least those created by what we'll call the effigy mound culture, remember the loose use of that word, only exist in the southern half of Wisconsin, a little bit into Illinois, a little bit into Iowa, a little bit into Minnesota. And they are not just randomly scattered upon that landscape, but they are certainly in locations that were considered important for one reason or another. The person who did this work was Dr. Amy Roseborough, who's the assistant state archaeologist in Wisconsin. For her PhD work, she went through every available record for every effigy mound that could possibly be found. And she was able to document roughly 3,200 effigy mounds that were ever recorded in one way or another. Being a very good scientist, when I say, okay, Amy, how many more do you think either are out there and have not been located? How many are, have been effaced or destroyed and were never recorded? And she won't say. I'm going to throw a number of perhaps 1,000, maybe 2,000. I think it's conceivable that there could have been as many as 5,000 of these effigy mounds on the landscape. But that makes them fairly rare. And our assumption, and perhaps Albert will have a better number for us when he speaks later, is that at least 2/3, and perhaps quite a bit more of those mounds, have been lost. And by lost, I mean that they primarily have been removed by European and other non-native use of the landscape. So what's left is fairly rare. We're down to, if we're lucky, perhaps 1,000 of these mounds that still exist on the landscape. Effigy mounds are a subset of other mounds, and there's been a lot of discussion earlier today about mounds. There are certainly many kinds of mounds that are out there from other cultures, and this map, where did this come from? This was from the Bureau of American Ethnology's work on mounds, Cyrus Thomas, in the late 1800s, gives some idea that there were mounds of various kinds really throughout the United States, but what makes what we have in this area is the fact that they are effigy mounds. These things are incredibly subtle on the landscape. You're looking at a group of 3 bear mounds at the moment. My guess is you're probably having a hard time seeing them. The one giveaway is that downed log that goes across the center of the photo is going across the snout of that bear. And the body is running lengthwise from you, and the feet are, my direction is right, off to the left. And I put this very hard image to see in to make the point that these are, in fact, incredibly subtle on the landscape. And it's part of why they are a challenge to care for. I'm going to do sort of a case study as we go through this and talk about a number of factors at various sites. This is a site that is about a mile from the Man Mound, and you'll see, and you may have taken my word for it, there are a number of trees that are actually growing right up out of that mound. So one of the basic things we think about is trees growing out of mounds are a problem because their roots can move the soil around in that mound. And the worst thing that will tend to happen is if that tree tips over and brings up a root ball, needless to say, it's going to cause a great deal of trouble to that mound. So one of the basic ideas is to remove trees from mounds. And in this case, were I to have the opportunity to work with this site, I would certainly go in and begin removing some of those trees from that mound. They are, as I said, incredibly subtle. And they are the creations of the native peoples who lived on this land. And I guess I want to emphasize this in case I have not emphasized it enough. These are burial sites. They are sites where the indigenous peoples of this land, during a time period roughly 1,000 years ago, roughly beginning about 700 up to about 1,100, depending exactly where you are, interred their dead, and thus are protected in many ways as burial sites. But I personally believe that they are much more than that. Not that they aren't important as burial sites, but we need to recognize that they have a greater meaning and a greater understanding. Even before Lapham's Antiquities of Wisconsin came out, one of the very first books that was written about mounds in the eastern United States was Squire and Daviess's The Ancient Monuments, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And I like that term monument because these mounds clearly are a monument that were created by a native people. If we think about monuments created by all cultures, they are often to represent a belief system, a thought, an idea, a understanding. And that's part of what effigy mounds do. What exactly that is not my place to say. But we need to respect these as such. They also have another interesting role, and that is as works of art. Remember the line that was used by the public land surveyors of keeping track of ancient works of art. And if I was an art historian standing here, I would describe these sites as being monumental scale earthen bas-relief sculptures. And they are. They are sculptures made from the very earth itself. Effigy Mounds National Monument, when Iowa was doing its Corridor for America the Beautiful series, Iowa chose Effigy Mounds National Monument to be its representative. And this was a corridor that came out on the 7th of February of last year for Iowa. How many of you have gotten these and changed sometime in the last? Not enough. Here's one right here. I bought a lot of them when they came out. I got them for 25 cents a piece, too. It was a good deal. And if any of you want to see one of these close up and even take one home with you, come back and see me afterwards and we can make arrangements. Actually more than that, let's be honest. You all carry bas-relief sculptures in your pocket right now. That's exactly what a coin is. It's a very low-relief sculpture that represents something. And that's why I love these, because they are bas-relief sculptures. I have to note that the guy who did this corridor complained about how difficult it was to make a drawing of effigy mounds in order for an engraver to make a bas-relief sculpture. And I just wanted to go up to him and say, duh, it starts as a bas-relief sculpture. You don't need to make a drawing of a bas-relief sculpture to have somebody else make a bas-relief sculpture of your drawing. Effigy mounds are works of art. They are burial sites. They are landmarks. They are monuments. They serve many, many purposes. This is one of the other sites that I deal with. It's called the Heim Mound. There's some discussion earlier today about how we name things. And unfortunately, in the archaeological world, we tend to name things for the owner of that site at the time it was recorded. In this case, it was a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Heim, and he owned, and again, these things are very hard to see on the landscape, he owned this mound and eventually would give it to the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, and I get to take care of it as part of my work with that organization. In the front, and we'll look at it more closely soon, is a marker on the spot. What you see kind of in green there, this is a spring photo, what you see in green is Vinca minor. You may have it in your garden, it's called periwinkle. Someone had the brilliant, in quotes, idea at some point of covering this mound with this nasty, invasive, European, I think British actually, plant that has just pushed out all the other native species. This site, it's a quarter-acre lot that this mound is on, and it has over 30 species of native wildflowers on it. It's a spectacular little place, but it's got this terrible infestation of Vinca minor, which we're trying to get rid of. This is what it looked like in the drawing that was done of it by Charles E. Brown back in 1915. It is a fox or a wolf-shaped mound, 120 feet from nose to tail. A spectacular site. It's actually a quite tall mound. It gets up to about 3 feet tall, which is on the tall end of effigy mounds. A couple of years ago, we removed several trees that were growing out of the mound, and the crew that was there removing trees, without asking permission, one of the tree crew started raking around the mound. And I didn't realize what he was doing until he told me that he'd been up in the bucket and you could barely see the shape of this mound, and he wanted to see what it looked like. So he raked around to expose the green leaves of the Vinca minor. And so when he went back up, I sent my camera with him. And so this is a photo of the head of that mound. You can see that there are several trees that are growing out of the mound, and those are the ones we were removing that day. In this case, it was sort of interesting. There are several wild black cherries that were growing out of the mound. And wanting to continue the idea of art with these, I had that wood milled down to 2 inches thick, and then a wood carver who's a friend of mine actually carved the image of the Heim Mound in wood that grew directly out of the Heim Mound. And we use those as a fundraiser for our work at that site. An interesting idea of going full circle. This is the plaque that was put on this site back in 1977. Unfortunately, one of the lines on that plaque, and that's why it's since been removed, or we're about to remove it actually, says, these were not used for burials. In fact, this was a mound that was excavated in the 1930s. It was trenched down the body, and there were no bones found. I think Phil was talking earlier about the fact that there are certainly burial sites that the material of that burial is long gone. So we do not have that material to say, yeah, there's a bone here. In this case, there were 2 large charcoal deposits, one in the shoulder and the other at the hip, and those were likely cremation remains. So again, we get back to the idea that even though we don't find remains in all mounds that are identified, we can make the supposition that all of these mounds are burial sites. This is another site that I work with. I'm just going to buzz through this one quickly. It's a water spirit mound. I've just started taking care of this one. And we burned the surface of this mound this spring. And really it was wonderful as a way of making that mound stand out. This one is a very sculptural mound, a very fascinating mound up near New Lisbon, Wisconsin. This is a mound at Devil's Lake State Park. Devil's Lake is not a really good name. Spirit Lake would be a whole lot better if you want it in English. If you want to use Ho Chunk, Dewankinchunk would be a much better name for this site, for Holy Lake or Spirit Lake. This is a bird mound that's in the south end. This is a drone photo. This is a mound, and Phil and I were talking about this earlier, that is often referred to as a human-shaped mound, because you see those wide wings, you only see the wing off to the right, and then the body and the split tail. Is this to be an actual bird, or is this to be a thunderbird? Is this to be one of those spirit figures as opposed to a physical animal? And these are all the things that we get to think about. In this site, there is a marker somewhat similar to the one at the Man Mound, and this kind of marker was put in on many mounds in Wisconsin by the Wisconsin Archaeological Society and other organizations, often listing in bold letters those organizations and not I want to go forward and grab that image. This is the kind of marker that was put on these things, and I have real mixed feelings about these, because sometimes I think of them as being the good housekeeping seal for effigy mounds. It's the idea that some European group, in this case the State Conservation Commission, has said this place is important and thus it's important, and if it's not there, then it's not important. So I think we need to be very careful about how we do signage at these sites, and this is one of those signs. This one isn't too bad. I really wish it would say something about who created this mound, rather than just giving the details. And this is a big piece of how we think about these mounds and managing these mounds, is how we interpret these and what we do as far as interpretive signage. This is also in that same park, and it's a little bit better interpretive sign. What you see behind it is a horribly overgrown mound. This is a water spirit mound that 90% of the visitors to Devil's Lake State Park, and I should note that Devil's Lake State Park gets almost as many visitors every year as Yellowstone. Just about every one of them drives by that mound, and you cannot see it because it is horribly overgrown. It's one of these mounds that used to be mowed. In this case, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources said, we got to get rid of that park grass on there, and they literally took a roundup and killed all the plants on the surface of that mound. I had a bit of a problem with that as being inappropriate. And then they set someone to work and said, plant prairie on it. And they went to a prairie seed catalog and got prairie. Unfortunately, the prairie that they planted, the plants that they planted on, are taller than I am by the end of the summer. And so this very subtle mound in the landscape is invisible. This goes back to that Groucho Marx thing. This is a mistake we learn from. May not be the perfect answer as to what to do, but we know this one doesn't work. This is the interpretive panel that I've got at the Man Mound. This is just a temporary panel. We're doing more permanent ones. And what I want to show is less the idea of what's on that panel and more how we've got it set. Originally, there was what we like to call in Wisconsin history on a stick. The 4x4 with the brown, 2 foot by 4 foot sign up there that gives all the information about it. And it was literally put in the ground 4 feet away from the edge of the mound. If nothing else, the thing that drove me nuts is you've got this incredibly subtle, wonderful mound spread out in front of you, and in order to read the interpretive panel, you got to go like this. Didn't make sense. It overwhelmed this subtle nature of this mound. So one of the things that we do at the Man Mound is we have a kind of standing rule that nothing that we put in will be taller than the mound itself. So in this case, this only gets up to being 30 inches. And it's also on an angle, so as you're looking at this, sort of like the top of this podium, I can be looking at this and then look up at that mound around it. And I think all of these things help set the tone for how we care for this site. Well, the last ones we're going to take a look at here is actually a site that's owned by the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's called Kingsley Bend. And this again gets into the idea of naming. This is a site that Kingsley Bend Mound Group is known for a white trader who had a cabin in this bend of the river just downstream from the Wisconsin Dells. And that site has long been called Kingsley Bend. Kingsley had nothing to do with those mounds. And I really wish we would come up with a term for this site that is respectful to the native peoples and their beliefs, and perhaps in the native language of the people of this area. This is again, one of these, this is somewhat bigger than a history on a stick. This sign is 6 foot by 4 foot roughly, and is actually remarkably good text for a 1971 sign. It tells the story fairly well, but also I think is too large and too overwhelming for the site. What you see to the right of the mound is a long linear mound. This one's maybe 800 feet long that runs right through the middle of this site. There is a map on this which helps because it does help people understand what's at this site. And this site is interesting because it has all 3 realms of at the top of the map, you see 2 bear mounds, nose to tail. Just north of the road, there is a water spirit mound, and south of the road is a bear. And what's interesting, and I have not spoken in depth with the Ho-Chunk cultural preservation folks about this, but they're using 3 decidedly different approaches to managing the mounds on this site. And let's take a quick look at them. Come in. Oh, look at that first. Quick LiDAR, you can see this is flipped from what we just looked at. The bird is up at the top. The bears are on the hillside at the south. The water spirit mound is, again, in this case, just south of the road. There's also a line of conical mounds that's at the very south edge of that. Oh, excuse me. These are the bears. This is on a really neat hillside. And what they've done here is they have mowed around the bears, but let the vegetation grow on the bears themselves. So the matrix being this mowed grass, the top being the wild vegetation. Pretty neat. I think the vegetation is a little bit long because it obscures the area a little bit, but it's really neat to see. And some years, depending exactly how they do the mowing, the highway that goes along through this site, you get this really neat view of these 2 bears on the hillside, nose to tail. This is a water spirit. You're looking at it from the head, the legs are down to the left, the body is in the distance, a delightfully long mound. But this mound is, as the Man Mound was mowed for a long time, mowed short like the rest of the area. So it's all kept as one length. So you see that shape fairly well, but the mowing concerns me a little bit. The bird mound is almost the exact opposite. It's in this area of restored prairie, and what they've done is gone through and mowed just the mound itself very closely. And I find it interesting that these 3 very divergent ways of caring for these mounds are all being done in the same place by the Ho-Chunk Nation. Again, I'm not saying that any of these things are the right way or the wrong way, but they are things to think about. This is just a quick look of what we do when we burn the Man Mound. And I'm just going to buzz through some of these real quick just because we're running out of time. This one drives me nuts. This is a mound in a little park area that was created, and the mound, this is a water spirit mound, mowed to within an inch of its life, and then for some reason they felt they needed to put a fence around it. And to me the question is, what are they fencing in and what are they fencing out? There's actually a photo that the state archaeologist uses of me. This fence is 5 feet tall, with my hands on it, shaking it. And apparently I look like, who was it in Parting the Red Sea in the movie, Let My Effigy Mound Go. This one drives me nuts. And the interpretive panel drives me nuts, and we won't go any further than that. This is a mound, a spectacular water spirit, again in the same area about 5 miles from the Man Mound. And what you see there, that bump coming out from the woods, that's the head, the back of the head of a water spirit that is 414 feet long. It is spectacular. This is a mound that I'd like to be able to work with a landowner to do a great deal of work to remove the woody vegetation from it as quickly as possible. One of the things that I really like about being here today is the good work that the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation is doing in understanding that dealing with archaeological sites and doing conservation work go hand in hand. And that's spectacular to think about. It is not one or the other. The Man Mound, and I'm just going to dwell on this for just a moment, the Man Mound is owned by the Sauk County Historical Society, managed by the county park system, Sauk County Park System. Sauk County, by the way, is named for the Sauk and Fox tribe, who did occupy the land at one point. And the county parks deals with this place like any other park. And my challenge as a volunteer caretaker of this place is mostly dealing with these two landowners who either are trying to deal with it as a park and not an archaeological site, or a cultural site, would be a better way of phrasing it, or I'm dealing with the owner who doesn't care about it, which is effectively what the Sauk County Historical Society is at. This is also not how to not care for a mound. This is a linear mound in Devil's Lake State Park. They decided they needed a better place to put their dumpsters, and that better place was right next to a linear mound, which also is horribly overgrown. This one's a little touchy. I have always been fascinated by what it was like to build an effigy mound. It is not my place, certainly, to build a mound. In fact, the traditional court of the Ho-Chunk Nation has said, we do not build mounds, we do not repair mounds. But I had this idea of creating a mound out of snow. Not an effigy mound, but very clearly a replica created in the shape of an effigy mound made out of snow. And it was a marvelous experience to think about what the work was to create this. And most importantly, there were 5 of us who did this together last winter. What was most fascinating about it was the discussion that we had while we were doing this. I should note that the 5 of us included a Menominee elder and his wife, who is an Oneida elder, and 3 white folks. And Mike, the Menominee elder, is very much involved with maintaining the traditions of Menominee, and he is of the Bird Clan, or Hawk Clan, I'm trying to remember, maybe it's Thunderbird Clan, of the Menominee. And to have him talk as he was directing us to make this mound was just a fascinating experience. I actually cleared this with the Ho-Chunk Nation ahead of time with the Historic Preservation Office, and I said, is this appropriate, inappropriate? And I got this wonderfully thoughtful letter back from the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and the thing that really sticks with me was he said, if you went out and made a snow angel, would Christians get upset? He said, as long as you're not calling it a mound, as long as you're not misrepresenting it, it is a wonderful experience. What got even more wonderful was about a month later when it looked like that. So we'll probably continue to do snow mounds. But using that image is an issue. And someone mentioned to me at one point that the Man Mound looks remarkably, I'm about to get the hook here, the Man Mound looks remarkably like the pedestrian in the pedestrian crossing sign, and suggested that it might be an interesting way to get people's attention to make signs that would play with that a little bit. And I made these signs. I actually hand-painted road signs. We put them up for a couple of special events. Town board didn't have the same sense of humor that I did. But interestingly, now 8 years later, they are allowing me to put those up permanently because they have come to value the Man Mound as a part of what we're doing. And if any of you think this is just humorous enough that you want your very own, we made bandanas out of that shape. And if anybody would like to help support the Man Mound, I'm sorry I have to do this plug, we're a nonprofit. I've got a bunch of them back there, and you can get one from me. So I'm going to take one last minute to finish up. This is the Man Mound. It is a site that I am passionate about caring for. And I care for it in the name of the people who created it 1,000 years ago. And I try, as I work with this site, to have a sense of what that responsibility is that I have. And it's a responsibility that all of us have, the folks who run the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. All of you as people who live on this land today, which was once the land of the indigenous peoples, that we have a responsibility to care for this land in their names. Thank you much. If you have questions, you'll have to see me.